Welcome back to the CHARA Project. I'm Heather Erickson.
I'm Sarah West.
And we have been uncovering difficult, maybe even confusing passages that we come across in the Bible. And as we've been doing that, we've been using our CHARA Bible Study guide. This is a free downloadable guide off of our website that asks specific questions that help you unravel what is the specific Bible passage mean. And so today we are tackling another new passage. Sarah, what's the passage we're going to go after today?
We're going to be in Mark 2:27, which says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Now that is actually a unique phrasing. It's actually called a chiasm, and a chiasm is it's a pattern. Under author, we talk about looking for different patterns. It could be repetition, alliteration. This one is a chiasm, but a chiasm is really when the second part of a sentence or saying flips the first part. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus also said the first shall be last and the last shall be first.
Yep.
So he actually uses these quite a bit. And I think there's maybe a couple of reasons that these are, maybe that Jesus used them or they just really stand out. One is because they do actually stand out. And they kind of make you think, like, what in the world is this, right? And it's also memorable.
Well, yeah, it would stop me in my tracks because I'd be like, wait a second, what are you saying? And any time I see this in the Bible, it does make me pause. So chiasms are a great way to get you to stop and pull back and say, wait a second, what is he trying to get across?
Right. It's almost like Jesus when he uses parables, right? Like, yeah, he has a great way of making us think.
I love it.
Which is good. So where we want to start, the first thing we're going to start with is context.
Context. We love context.
We often start here, and we're going to read what's leading up to this verse. So I'm going to start in Mark 2. I'll start with verse 23. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, this is Jesus speaking, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the Pharisees or the priests, and also gave some to his companions. Then he told them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath." So we see here Jesus' disciples or his followers are walking through these grain fields. They're picking the heads of the grain on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees are challenging Jesus on this, right? Like, why are your disciples doing this on the Sabbath? And that was key there. Not why are they working on the Sabbath? And Jesus' response, I think, is pretty unexpected. And he tells a story about David. He points back to David and his men when they ate the bread of the presence, which was set apart for the priests. So let's pause for a second here on context, and let's go talk about history for a minute.
I always love it when we go into history because there's always something interesting we're going to learn.
Yeah. So, and I think the question we should probably ask now is, who are these people? Who are we talking about? How does the text describe them? And because we just introduced two groups of people. We introduced the Pharisees, who are challenging Jesus on this, and we introduced David. And so one of the ways we can learn about both the Pharisees and David and a lot of the characters in the Bible is simply reading the text. There's a lot of text about both of these, both the Pharisees and David. So rather than reading all of that today,
we're not reading the whole Bible today.
No.
Oh man.
Let's point to how a study Bible can help.
Oh, that's great.
Right? So in the when we talk about the Pharisees, actually, my study Bible notes here told me to go read the notes here. So just to clarify, for those of you who aren't, maybe used to a study Bible or don't have one, typically at the bottom, after the scripture, at the bottom are a lot of commentary and helpful notes explaining what's going on.
Written by Bible scholars that it's multiple Bible scholars that are usually adding those commentary in to help us understand history or the language.
Right.
Lots of cool things that they are uncovering.
So helpful. And so I have my CSB Bible today. Heather, is this your NIV?
Yeah, my tried and true NIV.
Right.
Yep.
So scripture is the same. I mean, they might be little words translated slightly differently, but the message is the same. The scripture is the same. Our study notes are different.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what makes them so fun.
Which is also why Sarah and I happen to have a couple of different study Bibles that we own.
Yeah.
Is sometimes when we see it in one Bible, we want to see what other biblical scholars have mentioned. So we'll open up more than one study Bible to see what they have to say.
Absolutely. So here's just a note that I'm going to read out of my study Bible that describes a little bit about the Pharisees that I thought was helpful. It says the Pharisees, or the separated ones, strictly observed the written and oral law. And the oral law was really an add-on that they over time, and we'll get back to that. So they strictly observed the written and oral law. They believed in angels and the resurrection. They opposed Greek influence and were esteemed by the people. They were constantly in conflict with Jesus. So they were, according to this, strict adherers of the law, and they often had conflict with Jesus. And they were also highly esteemed at that time.
Well, and if you're reading the text, you can see that most often when Jesus is talking and kind of getting a little bit frustrated with a group of people, it tended to be the Pharisees because of the way they were twisting the law and kind of pushing on things that weren't where the heart was of the law was at. So this is something we can also see a little bit in the text.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
When we just read that. So absolutely. And so when we look at David, I mean, my goodness, we can read 1st and 2nd Samuel to learn a lot about David. Another way you can do this is you actually can turn to the concordance in the back of your Bible. And I already did this. I'm not going to do this right now. But I just looked up David, and it told me a whole bunch about his life and little references on where to go. To summarize a few parts of his life, David was one of Israel's greatest kings. He wrote a lot of the Psalms, so a lot of poetry that we find in the Bible. He also was God promised him that there would be a forever king that would come from his line. This future Messiah would come from King David's line. And you see that in 2 Samuel. So he was highly, highly esteemed by the Jewish people. So that's a little bit of who we're talking about here. And another question, how would the original audience then have heard this? The Pharisees would have been familiar with this when Jesus shouts out and points back to David. The Pharisees would have been very familiar with this. They knew the Old Testament forwards and backwards. And so what that story, if we were to turn to 1 Samuel, it's found in Samuel 21, 1 through 6. David was fleeing from King Saul, who was trying to kill him. And as Jesus describes, him and his followers were in need and hungry. And so they eat this consecrated bread, this bread of the presence that technically was reserved for the priests. And that points back even further to Leviticus 24, 5 through 9. And again, I'm not going to read those, but it talks about this bread that was found in the tabernacle. And there was 12 loaves of bread that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And it was actually exchanged weekly. And it served as a reminder of God's provision, both during Israel's time in the wilderness, also for the priests whose job in their time was spent in the temple and in the tabernacle doing this work. So God provided for them with this bread of the presence. It was both a provision and a reminder of God's goodness.
I love it. So now we're seeing Jesus trying to reference the story. They would have known all of this ahead of time, that Leviticus has already talked about this bread and how David interacted with it in a way that was against the law. Like how David technically was hanging out and eating that bread would have been probably not lawful, quote unquote.
Right. And yet the priest allows him to do it. And so the point that we kind of see here is the bread provided food for David and his followers when they were hungry. Just like the grain in the story in Mark 2 provides food for Jesus and his followers when they were hungry. The law was not meant to be a burden. It was meant to help them. The Sabbath law, we'll get into this more, was meant to be a help, not a burden. And yet the Pharisees, they added on to the Sabbath law. They with creating kind of these extra laws just so that you didn't even come close to breaking the first one.
Yeah, because there were 613 laws that are listed off in the Old Testament and that the Jewish people would have known. And these Pharisees, they ended up adding like 1,000 additional laws, almost what I call bubble wrap around the laws. It's like, you don't want to break the one law. You don't want to, eat the one sandwich. So you're just not going to be able to eat bread in general. It kind of had that was not a law, by the way. But that gives you a little bit of a color of let's just make a rule around the rule around the rule so that we make sure that we're not going to break it?
Well, and you kind of see this here because the original law is really about harvesting grain, and they're not really harvesting; they're walking along having a snack.
Yeah.
Is the way I'm reading this, and so they created all these extra, no snacks, no picking, don't pick a blackberry and snack on it on the Sabbath kind of thing.
Right.
So yeah, he's challenging them in their interpretation and strict adherence to the law because it's creating a burden, and that's not what the original law was for.
No,
It was
I like
to help them rest.
I like that.
So we'll get into more the
That
Sabbath
history,
here.
though, helped
Yeah.
us understand a little bit more about
I hope so.
David. So
Yeah.
where do we go after that?
You know what? Let's return back to context now and keep reading. It seems that the issue that Jesus is addressing here, from what we just read, is again, it's the Pharisees were ignoring the original intent in the heart behind God's law. They had made the law more important than people. It's like they got it backwards. The law was, as we said, given to give them rest, not a burden. And the Pharisees had placed themselves really above God's law by adding on to it. And Jesus, I love this in verse 28, the verse right after, Jesus reminds them who wrote the law, who is the author of the law. So right after our verse in Mark 2, where it says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, it says, so then the Son of Man, Jesus, is Lord even of the Sabbath. It begs the question, well, who made the law, right? Who's the author of this law? And we discover through Scripture, both in John 1 and Hebrews 1, that Jesus, God in the flesh, is the creator of all things. He is the creator as God's Son. He's the creator of the law, the originator, the author of the law. So he should be the one that has authority over how it is interpreted.
Oh, I love that. And what's crazy is if you've never studied Mark, one of the things I love about Mark is that he was writing to a Roman audience that cared a lot about the authority of who they were going to follow. So almost throughout the entire book, he presses on this idea of authority and making sure that his listeners knew Jesus had authority. And you see it very clearly in this verse.
Right,
Jesus just mic drops a little bit. And Mark's the only one that covers this part of this parable, or not parable, but the story, if I remember correctly. And I think it's because he wants to be able to prove who this Jesus really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is so fun because Jesus actually keeps going here. And so we're going to read a little bit more because he's like just driving this point home.
Oh, so good.
And so check this out. If I were to keep reading here, and now I'm in chapter 3, once again, we're going to kind of look for the main idea. Sometimes that will go past chapter and verse numbers. We've talked about that before. I'm going to read a little bit, 6 verses in chapter 3. And it says, Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, they, again, this is the Pharisees, were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. So I love that the Pharisees are like, they're out to test him. Let's see what he's going to do here, right? And so Jesus told the man with the shriveled hand, stand before us. So Jesus knows. He knows where they're at. He's like, go ahead, stand before us. Let's make an example here. And then he said to them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts, and he told the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. I love Jesus's point here. Should I do good or evil? Should I take life, give life or take life, right? Like, what is the heart behind the Sabbath? And so I love that he says that. And they actually really clearly have no response here. There's no response. It says they were silent. Like there's
mic drop.
Yeah.
It truly was a Jesus mic drop moment. And we have a lot of those. I always love it when he does it because there's nothing they could have said.
No. In fact, here they're actually publicly shamed. And you see that without them having any response and being shamed. Jesus took their shame. This is where you see from then on, they go out to plot how to kill him.
It would have really been a sting to them for sure. So this is taking away their power. It's taking away their authority. And that's not what they wanted. This is their livelihood. I mean, this is how they made money. This is how they had a house and how they had power. So I can see where they'd be upset. But it's, Jesus
shows
is showing
here,
them what's right.
Yeah, and Jesus shows here that the Pharisees, they cared more about the adherence to extra biblical laws that they'd added than the goodness to mankind.
Yeah.
They'd put the law ahead of man.
Yeah.
And it's the point Jesus is making here. And they also made themselves the interpreter of the law. And Jesus
careful.
going, though the Son of Man, he's the, how did they word it? He's the Lord even of the Sabbath. I have the authority over the laws that I create, which makes sense.
So good.
Right? Yes. So let's see. Let's go ahead and transition here and learn a little bit more about the Sabbath now.
That's good.
And so let's go to research. And one of the things that we often do is we ask, what kind of questions do you have on this passage? And the question here simply, I would think is, well, what is the Sabbath?
How do we define that?
Yeah, and what was its original purpose? So let's take a moment here and go look at that. If we were to look at the word meaning in Hebrew, it is Sabbat, which means to rest or stop or cease from work. And so to rest or to stop, cease from work. One of the places we see that in the Bible, in fact, actually the first place we see this in the Bible, is not a bad place to go. Kind of a good question is where do you first see this come across, this theme in the Bible? So let's look at some Bible context here. It actually goes back to creation. And just after Jesus creates the world in 6 days, and the people and the animals and everything in it, on the seventh day, in Genesis 2:2-3, it says, on the seventh day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. So, probably important to note here, well, was God tired, right? Like, was he just...
I need a break. I need a nap.
Right? Now, I would be.
I would need a nap. I need a nap after just like walking upstairs, though, but that's a whole other issue.
Right? Well, God is all powerful. He's omnipotent. He's all powerful. So it's not that God needed a break here, but he did stop from work and gives us an example, his own example later on to follow. And we see this theme carry on in Deuteronomy 5, and I believe it's the fourth of the 10 Commandments, where we see God talk about the Sabbath. So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12-15, it says, "Be careful to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or donkey, and any of your livestock, or the resident alien who lives within your city gates, so that your male and female slaves may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So we see on this seventh day, we're to cease doing any work. That includes not just us, but it includes any servants, any resident aliens. It also includes the animals.
I love it.
I know, right? I love that.
My cat will appreciate that, knowing that he gets an extra nap in, like he doesn't already take a bunch.
And even if you were to flip over to Exodus 23, even the land, after 7 years, even the land was to take a rest. And it would allow the poor people to go in and gain food, as well as the wild animals.
Right.
I love how God takes care of all of his creation.
That's exactly what I was just thinking. I was like, oh my goodness, we see God's just thoughtfulness and caring and mercy that comes in with his people to say, I know you need this.
So you see this theme in the Old Testament of a ceasing, of stopping work, and for us, rest. And it being really a gift from God for us. Now, if that's kind of Old Testament, if we were to look at some context in the New Testament, and the way I found these references is simply through cross-references. As I was reading here in Mark, and it talked about the Sabbath, these are some of the cross-references it went to, and I'm not reading all of them, but here's a couple of them. And it pointed to Colossians 2:16-17, which says, "Therefore, don't let anyone judge you in regard to food and drink, or in a matter of festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of what was to come. The substance is Christ." So the summary of what was to come, the substance of what was to come is Christ. And I love that wording. These were a shadow, and they all pointed to Christ. So, it kind of begs the question, how does this Sabbath, fit into the big story of the Bible?
Right.
And it points to Jesus really being our Sabbath rest. I mean, in the Old Testament, the law highlighted our need for Jesus. And no one could fulfill that law perfectly. And the forgiveness of sins and the atonement and the sacrifices, all of that was temporary. And so it all points to Jesus being the one who completes the law, who fulfills the law, as we see in Matthew 5:17, and whose death and resurrection is our his sacrifice is how we are forgiven for sins. And so we no longer need to do the works of the Old Testament law to gain righteousness before God. We gain righteousness through God through Jesus.
Oh, I love that.
Through belief in Jesus.
What an encouragement this is.
Right? So instead of all the works that we used to have to do, we get to rest in Jesus's work, his completed work. So I was reading this morning a really great website called the gotquestions.org. That's what it is, gotquestions.org. And I went to their website and I typed in Sabbath, and they had so many articles on this and a ton of articles that actually pointed to Jesus and how Jesus is our Sabbath rest. So I thought they were really, really great. We're just barely nicking the surface here. But if you want to look at that further, I would recommend going and checking those out. So Heather, how are we doing here?
I think we've gone through almost every single CHAR, but we haven't gotten to apply. I feel like we're getting to apply.
Yeah,
But is there
that's
more?
fair.
Is there more from an application perspective of how you would want to tackle this?
Yeah, let's go to apply now. And I think there's a couple of questions that we ask in apply that could be really good. But I think one of them that might be worth asking is, it's a respond question. What was expected of the original audience, and what principles make sense for us now? Is this cultural truth, or is it timeless truth?
Cultural meaning that it was meant for them back then, at that moment, at that time.
Yes.
Timeless meaning for us today.
Yes, exactly. And this is probably a question that a lot of us ask about the Sabbath, right? So the Old Testament, as we kind of just talked about, they had a lot of rules about what they could and could not do on the Sabbath. And so the question being, do we have to follow those today? Can we pick a head of grain today? And you can see here that there's a shift, as we kind of hinted on already. There's a shift that Jesus brought. It changed when Jesus came.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you look at the New Testament and look through what of the 10 Commandments were repeated, we see every single one of them repeated but the Sabbath. And we see this type of passage instead where Jesus is actually, kind of pushing on the idea of Sabbath. There is no law that says we're supposed to keep the Sabbath. It's because Jesus is our Sabbath. We're uncovering this already.
Well, and isn't it interesting? Because that's what we tend to do this. Just like the Pharisees had built all this list of, I can do this, but I can't do this on the Sabbath. We tend to want to do the same thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
I'd love a checklist. That would be great.
Right? But if we can look at this, the context around this and what this passage is saying is, I mean, first of all, this was meant to be a gift of rest for man. It was supposed to be for us, not an added burden. Right. So keep that in mind. This wasn't intended to be an added burden. And now we find our rest in Jesus. And so as we kind of go to apply this to our lives, I think what would be important is that we always have that in our mind. God created mankind to need rest, yeah. But as we consider if we want to celebrate a Sabbath or how that might look for you or for I, are we doing it with the intent of just resting in Jesus and recognizing that he fulfilled the law and all of those works? So all of those things Jesus did for us and how grateful we are for that.
I love that. And so that, I mean, you're hitting a point where Sabbath may look a little different for us. Like if I were sitting on the other side of this microphone, the question I might be asking was, well, how do I observe Sabbath then if there are no rules, or how does that look?
Well, I would consider praying about that. Read
That's
more
right.
on this subject, but I would consider praying about that. Lord, what would it look like for me to find rest in you?
Thank you.
And it might be on Sunday. It might be another day. It might be for a little series of time throughout your week. I know personally, God knows his creation. I know personally when I don't find time to rest, I'm not reflecting in all that God has done for me. I'm irritable. I just ask my kids. I'm cranky. I lose my patience quickly. I feel sorry for myself. I'm complaining, grumbling. I'm definitely not in the mode of recognizing God's provision and resting in Jesus's work on the cross. So I feel like God knows us well.
Well, and knows that each individual person might need something different. But at the heart of it, if I'm hearing the application of this passage, when Sabbath is made for man and man is made for, not man made for Sabbath, the idea, I said that backwards. Sabbath was not made for man. How did we
I know, right?
This chiasm is getting me all mixed up. The
twister.
Sabbath was made for man, not man
Yeah.
made for Sabbath. There we go. I'm going to get it at some point. What I love about this verse, though, is that the importance has to rest in, we're resting in Jesus.
Yeah.
And that could look different for all of us, but the idea is that this is such an encouraging passage because I automatically think, I grew up in a family where we had certain rules around how we were going to follow the Sabbath. We had certain ways that we had to do stuff, and it wasn't necessarily a ding on my family and my upbringing. It was just the way that they ran the house. And I look back at that and saying, what a great encouragement this verse is to say, you can let that go at the wayside. You don't have to come with your list of things to do. Instead, you get to rest.
Right.
Just rest in the gift of who Jesus is and what he has done for
Yeah.
you. That is so encouraging. Now, is there anything else that you would uncover about this verse before we wrap up, Sarah?
We could talk about another reply question in here would be, what do you learn about God? And I love here that he not only, I love that I see that he creates mankind and he knows what's best for us. And sometimes we might look at like the Sabbath and think of all these, right, depending on what faith background or background you were raised in, you might think of the Sabbath and you might think of a list of rules. That's not what this passage is uncovering.
No.
And that's not the heart that we see behind God. I mean, the Sabbath was made for man. It was made for man to have rest and to reflect on him and in his goodness. So I learned quite a bit about God's heart. It's not a heart of do this, don't do that. It's a heart of wanting rest for his creation and so we can have a relationship with him and we can praise him and worship him and all that he's given us.
What an encouraging, after such a difficult passage we thought this was going to be, it actually is quite life-giving. And
I think so.
I think this is an encouraging passage. So for those of you that are interested in learning more about how to study the Bible, maybe this is the first time you've run across the CHARA Project, make sure you not only download the CHARA Bible Study Guide, but we also have additional episodes that uncover difficult passages, as well as one specific one that is how to study using the CHARA Study Guide. And it is a longer episode, but totally worth it if you're wanting to dive in and learn how to study this on your own. The Bible is amazing and its message is joy-filled, and you get to understand it more when you uncover what it's meaning.
Yeah, because we didn't uncover every question in this CHARA Bible Study Guide, just a couple of them.
And yet at the same time we're walking away both understanding this passage way more clearly. And so for that, we're so thankful, Sarah. Thank you for walking us through this passage. Make sure you get a chance to download the guide if you haven't done so already, and we look forward to talking to you soon.